In our next section, we are talking about how we can separate genuine sustainability from greenwashing. First up, to provide a bit of context into the broader ESG movement, we have a video.
ESG, or Environmental, Social and Governance criteria, are a set of standards used by investors to assess the sustainability and societal impact of a company. Looking at the number of searches for ESG provided by a popular search engine, it is fair to say that ESG has experienced a drastic increase in popularity in recent years. But let's back up a bit. Where did this notion come from? What are businesses and investors practicing today? And how legitimate are sustainability efforts really? The birth of modern-day corporate social responsibility goes back as far as rich industrialists in the 18th and 19th centuries, who built hospitals, museums, public baths and reading rooms for the benefit of factory workers. However, the post-World War II era really brought together government, business and trade unions based on an appreciation of the importance of social justice in securing peace. In the 1960s, people were made more aware of the explicit connection between environmental degradation and corporate activity, with the buried chemical waste at Love Canal in New York, the Chernobyl nuclear disaster, and the Exxon Valdez oil spill, a few major examples. The 1970s saw the rise of non-governmental environmental groups, such as Greenpeace and Friends of the Earth, which for the first time shifted focus away from governments onto the corporate sector. In the 1980s, the concept of corporate social responsibility became part of mainstream management theory, with the help of Edward Freeman's book, Strategic Management: A Stakeholder Approach. Transparency and traceability in the supply chain became a more important concern. The 1990s saw much greater international cooperation between business and society to address sustainable development challenges. Terms like triple bottom line and natural capitalism were coined. The UN Global Compact, an initiative to encourage businesses worldwide to adopt sustainable and socially responsible policies, was established in 2000. Since then, the pattern of collaboration between business and civil society has grown. Businesses are increasingly embracing environmental, social, and governance issues, ESG, in response to both public and investor demand. Morningstar recently found that 73% of its ESG indexes have outperformed their non-ESG equivalents since their inception. In addition, ESG funds captured $51 billion of net new money from investors in 2020, a figure double that of the previous year. However, as consumer and investor preferences shift towards more sustainable goods and companies, businesses have realized the marketing appeal of appearing more environmentally conscious. This is where greenwashing comes in. It can be described as a form of commercial propaganda that makes a company appear more sustainable than they really are. The danger here is that businesses and people feel they are doing the right thing when they might actually be exacerbating the problem. Greenwashing makes it difficult for consumers to differentiate between what is truly environmentally friendly and what is not. And it perpetuates a disconnect from the true cost of green goods and services. In the energy industry, greenwashing mostly appears in the form of companies claiming to be 100% renewable, despite not buying power directly from renewable generators, or promoting renewable energy services while continuing to invest in fossil fuels. Corporations, investors, and consumers all play a role in combating greenwashing and encouraging legitimately sustainable practices that reduce carbon emissions.
To delve deeper into this topic, we have a very fascinating lineup of panelists today. First up, we have Wieland Holfelder, who joined Google in 2008 and now oversees their engineering center in Munich, focusing on privacy and security. He is also a senior technical advisor for digital sovereignty and a member of Google's Global Sustainability Board. Before this, Wieland worked in Silicon Valley for over 10 years, among others as Vice President and CTO of Mercedes-Benz Research and Technology North America, Inc. He holds a PhD in computer science and was recognized as a GI Fellow by the German Computer Science Association. Thanks for taking the time to join us today, Wieland.
Thanks for having me.
Great. We also have Daria Saharova, who has 20 years of experience in entrepreneurship and finance behind her, and was recently awarded Best Female Investor by the German Startups Association. In her last role as managing partner of Veto One, she built the first German-based prop tech and energy tech venture capital. Daria also co-founded the think tank 1E9 and is an expert advisor to the European Commission. Hi Daria, thanks for joining.
Hi, thank you for having me too.
And last but certainly not least, we have Tim Schumacher, a serial entrepreneur, think Sado, IO and SaaS Group, and an investor focusing on software and green tech startups. In the past, Tim has invested in several ventures, including Ecosia, Solar, Surplus, Pachama, Carbon Cloud, and last but not least, gridX. Thanks, Tim.
Hello from Cologne.
Okay, so to start off the discussion, how do you view ESG in your organization? Is it an advantage or a burden? Starting with Wieland.
I actually think it's a huge opportunity and therefore also an advantage because you can differentiate by doing the right things. Google certainly is very much focused on ESG in many different areas. But if you just look back how Google started, we actually started not with a business. The business model came many years after Google was founded. But it was really this idea of organizing the world's information and making it universally accessible and useful. And then, the product worked. And then I think it was 3 years after the company was founded, AdWords, the business model behind search, was actually added on top of it. So I think that is one example. Sustainability is another one where we see a huge opportunity, and we have a very strong track record. We've eliminated all of our carbon emissions since 2007, and we're carbon neutral for the last 4 years, and we have bigger plans that I can talk about later in this area as well. But it's really, I think, a huge opportunity for companies to show that they're not just after business, but they want to do the right thing.
Tim, what's your take on it?
Well, I certainly would agree that it's. It is. First of all, I think it's a human duty. I think we should not think of it from a kind of organizational standpoint only. Is it good for the organization? But I think any decent human being should do it. It's like basically, should you murder people in your organization? Yes or no? Choice is pretty clear. And I think ESG should be the same. And then sure, there's some companies who do it better than others. And I think rightfully so. The market, employees, customers, they reward them for that. I think that's what's happening in the market. So definitely, I would agree with Wieland that it's an advantage, and every organization should be encouraged to pay more attention.
Do it. What exactly do you mean by that?
Sorry, say again. I think the connection was not really strong.
Sorry, Tim, when you say everyone should do it, what exactly do you mean by that?
So I think every organization should place a kind of more focus, more resources in ESG, and especially kind of move the needle. I mean, ESG is a very broad topic, and there are like minimum thresholds where companies maybe adhere to minimum standards, if so, and then there are other companies who really bake sustainability into their business model and go above and beyond. Same with certifications. As with everything, there are certifications which are minimum, think organic food, for example. Organic food has tons of labels. There are some which are super minimum and others which go above and beyond. And so, of course, it's hard for the consumer to look through that. But I think every organization should strive for the maximum there, or kind of at least the most possible what can be achieved.
And Daria, do you have anything to add on that?
Yeah, I think I agree with both of them, but I think you have to distinguish between the regulatory kind of body and then framework, and how organizations actually apply it and then live it, right? Because I think if you kind of say if it's an advantage or if it's the burden, I think in the moment when kind of the European Commission in the EU actually places a framework out of on the street, and then each country and then again it breaks down to on the organizational company kind of level. There is a difference between I place like the rules and then I live by these rules, and then actually it's not only about the rules, but it's about what makes sense and what we have to do on a personal level. And I think it's an advantage of course, but I think we should kind of be aware to create frameworks where it is possible and there is incentivization put in place to understand and to live by these rules.
And companies are increasingly looking beyond shareholder value to stakeholder value, which also takes employees, customers, partners into account. Do you think this is necessary, Tim?
Definitely. I mean, this approach, I would say, isn't new. I mean, the stakeholder approach has been, I would say, there before the focus on shareholder value came into being. If you don't treat your employees well, if you don't treat your community well, those things will backfire. And there's no doubt that you should take the broader constituencies into account.
And Wieland, what is Google doing to take stakeholder value into account and look beyond financial return?
So, one of the things that fascinated me before I joined Google was actually its mission. And Larry and Sergey, our founders, have written a very remarkable founders letter back in 2004. And I don't know if any of you have ever had a chance to see it, but the TLDR was basically, it's an owner's manual for Google's shareholders. And they explained that Google is not a conventional company and we do not intend to become one. And then they listed a bunch of examples why that is so. And they addressed exactly the stakeholders, not just the shareholders. For the shareholders, they basically said, listen, if you invest in Google, be prepared that we're not in this for the short term. We will sacrifice the short term for the longer term, right? So basically expectation management for the shareholders, that we're trying to do what's right, not what's best for the financial market. And then on the employees, Larry and Sergey basically said that, the employees are the most important asset that we have as a company, and we will treat them well. We will provide unusual benefits that other companies don't provide, and we will increase them rather than decrease them over time. And this is true until today, that we have really unusual benefits, and that is certainly not something that we want to use to have people join Google, but this is something to make sure that the best people that we hire actually feel happy and stay with Google, and so on and so forth. I can mention a few other stakeholders, like the community with google.org, where we are using some of our profits to invest in the biggest challenges that we have in humanity, and so on and so forth. And also developers and customers, we're trying to create more value, and we're ultimately dependent on the success of others. Google could not do well if others do not well. So if developers are doing well, Google is doing well. If customers are doing well, Google is doing well. So there's actually an incentive in this whole model that we're driving that leads to exactly that approach, that we need to address all the stakeholders.
Can I follow up on this? Because I think I've never seen any other company which kind of can motivate and make their employees so excited about themselves on such long term. It's always fascinates me. So could you maybe elaborate a little bit more? What do you do? Also in terms of ASG, right? And also in terms of diversity, maybe So what concrete measures has Google learned which actually are not only rules and are not only kind of compliant check boxes, but how do you manage that to do that?
So I think you talked directly about the employees, right?
Yeah, I talk about employees. I always think like, oh, they're so like brainwashed. Sorry.
No, I mean, a few examples is, for example, that we have an amazing program if you want to donate to charitable causes, that the company matches up to $6,000 a year in donations. So if I donate to a charitable cause, then Google will double that, right? So it just donates exactly the same amount. I donate €1,000 and then Google donates another €1,000. So for me, it's a tax advantage. I only really pay whatever, 500 something, right? But the organization receives 2,000. That's a huge lever, right? And that incentivizes employees to give. And so we have special events where we actually organize the Googlers and say, here are the causes that you should give to. And there's a huge amount of money that comes together in donations. And then Google.org does the same thing. If there's humanitarian disasters, they basically do the same thing. They encourage Googlers to donate to these causes, and then they have special budget to double these donations. Also, when we actually just have now soon coming up what we call the Google Surf Week, where we send Googlers into organizations to help them. And obviously this is on company time, but then every hour that you spend there, you can actually also get reimbursed, if you will, but not you get reimbursed, but the organization you help gets reimbursed on an hourly basis for the work that you're giving, and so on and so forth. So there's lots of these types of examples where if you come in and you see that and you're like, wow, this makes a ton of sense. And clearly in our industry, we're privileged in terms of the salaries that we can make. But then incentivizing to give back, I think, is something that is in the company's responsibility.
Mm-hmm. And we've had a few viewer questions regarding net zero goals. Wieland, is offsetting carbon enough to become net zero? And can a single organization become net zero in itself? Or do we need the entire ecosystem to become net zero?
We absolutely need the entire ecosystem, and I think we've reached net zero, but we don't think it's enough. And we have gotten to this point where we say, in the last 4 years, we've compensated our CO2 emissions with renewable energy, but not on a daily basis, an hourly basis, and so there's still emissions on the one hand, and then we compensate not by credits, but by actually buying renewable energy and feeding it back to the grid. So it's actually the better way to do this. But in the future, our promise is that we will actually be 24/7 around the clock carbon free. So we never actually create any carbon emissions in the first place. And I think that is the important piece. And then obviously the power that our technology has and our platform has and the reach that we have with our users, our goal is to go way beyond that. Because if companies use our AI and ML algorithms to save energy in their cooling, and if users use our products to choose a more environmentally friendly route in Google Maps, we have multiple billion users, then obviously that has a huge impact. And I think that is the opportunity that we have to leverage the platform that Google provides.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So if I may put this a little bit into perspective, I mean, Google certainly has a lot of great efforts and things like the Maps feature, for example, that I think is really good because it has an impact way beyond Google's own reach. The net zero goal, to be honest, I find it very unambitious for organizations these days. Just put it into perspective. I mean, search with Ecosia, I happen to know a little bit about search. Google obviously knows more about this, but we know a little bit. And according to our calculation, and give or take, certainly a couple percent, but a search is about 3 grams of CO2. And of course, you minimize that by what you said. efficient server usage, you try to cut fossil fuel out of the energy supply chain, and so on and so forth. But take Ecosia now, where we take the money which we make with searches through ads, same business model as Google, and plant trees. And on average, a search brings 1 kilogram in offsetting. So that's a 300x relationship. So essentially, that's kind of the difference of the ambition level versus, okay, I'm just going to be net zero. And no, we're going to bake sustainability into the business model. And that's what I said earlier. I think that the general approach of saying for most companies we're net zero is okay, and for some it's actually super ambitious. I mean, if you're like an automotive company or a food producing company, it's super ambitious, net zero. If you're a digital company like most of the ones here in the room, I'd actually say it's actually a pretty lame goal compared to many goals we have.
But Tim, no, Tim, I think you misunderstood our actual state of affairs, right? We are 100% renewable already today. So
I know.
Yeah.
That's what I'm saying.
But it's 100% renewable. It's not just net zero, which is different, right?
No, but that's what I say. It's like offsetting 3 grams, or not offsetting, or being net zero on something where it's 3 grams of CO2 compared to if you have things in your business model. That is what I mean with the ambition level. And there, I think Google could do.
But the ambition level to get to 24/7 completely carbon-free energy, you never actually even emit, is huge, especially at the scale of the energy usage that companies like ours have. And then over and on top of that, we're doing a lot of things that obviously are and we're planting trees as well, by the way, and at a similar scale. And Ecosia needs to actually, get their search algorithms run somewhere and on some search engines, and they produce
on Microsoft, which is also carbon neutral, so it's the same thing, but
carbon neutral but not renewable. And the other thing that I think is important is when we buy renewable energy, we don't go to the market and buy renewable energy. We create the amount of renewable energy that's needed for us new. Meaning we increase the overall renewable energy market with power purchase agreements that are long-term, so that the investment is actually worth it, so that the overall market becomes cheaper and sustainable. So that is also, I think, unique to the approach that we're taking.
No, absolutely, you should do that. I mean, Ecosia would be doing that. But my point was that the business model itself often has the bigger potential. I mean, take gridX for example. Just gridX being net zero would be a relatively small effect, but the effect of the company by using the potential to reduce energy consumption in other areas, that is huge, and that's what I'm basically challenging you a little bit, Wieland, on the search part, is that I think there can be a lot more. But let's not make this about Google and Ecosia. But I wanted to challenge.
I like it, guys. Go on.
It could be an even more ambitious goal, to be honest. That's my whole point.
We should take that offline, Tim, because I think marketing is a huge factor here, and that statement. I respect what Ecosia is doing. Don't get me wrong, but I think if you double click on what we're doing and look into our sustainability reports and also what we're doing, then I think you will find that. This is in sum and in total more than any other company right now is doing.
Just to put the question back onto Daria and Tim, obviously big advocate of what gridX is doing, but don't you think it's easier to bake it into the DNA, as you said, Tim, when it's a smaller agile company versus a multinational corporation?
It's a good question. I think, as I said, the set of rules and incentives has to be right and in balance. And of course, it's easier if you start a company and it's a smaller scale and you have 30, 50 employees and the kind of still founder driven. Easier to learn from each other, but I don't I think you have to live by that. You have to live and show by example, and I think that is possible on both a scale or a smaller scale. Probably takes longer because you have to roll it through the organization, but I don't think I think it both is possible.
Mm-hmm. And Tim, have you ever been in a situation where you've had to weigh up the choice between shareholder value and other factors like sustainability?
I mean, of course, every organization has to do that all the time. As long as the external factors and pollution isn't priced in properly, you do that constantly. And then it's kind of just the question on what you've decided for as a company mission.
Can we change the system so that you don't have to choose between the two?
Well, the main system would be pricing in externalities correctly. That's so. For example, a proper CO2 price of 200 euros and more, that would go a long way in that segment of CO2. Of course, there are lots of other emission factors which wouldn't be covered by that. So that's essentially where regulation needs to come in.
And what about internal carbon taxes within companies? Do you think that could be a solution, or do you think we need to rely on regulation?
It can be a solution, but at the end of the day, it's something then which some companies do and others don't, and so you're back to some abusing the system and others not, and it's of course better than nothing, but it should be. It's one of those things. It should be a top down from.
Yeah. I actually agree. Just thinking about what Tim you're saying, I don't think change comes like naturally to us on a global scale. I think then if you have the choice not to change or to change, especially if it comes at cost, whatever cost, an effort, cost of cash. You don't, and if you have the choice, you will not go for that. That's the nature of in our human nature. So I think the role of the regulator is really important here and really significant. And it's not that one-dimensional, right? So it's just not about putting something on paper. I told it many times because the discussion we have now about this new frameworks is kind of reminds me of the discussion when I kind of we used to work in the investment banking. We talked about compliance out of the sun, right? And it just words are words, and if it's just not mandatory, you put your cross whatever you have to cross. In I used to work in a listed U.S. investment bank, and then all our managing directors actually asked all the juniors to always make all the tests, and then it was done for half a year or a quarter, whatever it was in the mandatory, and then nothing happens, right? Nothing changes. So I think it's a multi-dimensional game, and the regulator really we have to make some things mandatory, and even if it's uncomfortable in the beginning. But then if we take this global problem, right? It doesn't make, it's just, again, so it doesn't, if Google we assume Google does all the right things, it's great. But if all the others don't, it doesn't matter. In this game, on the global scale of the problems, of the climate crisis, one doesn't if not everyone does, or the majority does, go with the change, no change happens.
If we take this top-down approach, does that mean consumers don't really play a role, or do they need to drive demand for green goods and services?
I think you have the equilibrium, right? It's demand meets the consumer. I think consumers really if we look at Fridays for Future, actually that's you can see how and it's a consumer play, right? So you can see how this kind of movement, even though probably on the global scale of our global population, a small one, yet had such a great impact, right? If you look on demand, if you look in different industries, let's start with the food industry, and you talk to experts there, they say that after the Fridays for Future, actually the awareness was there, but the call to action to change the behavior, to maybe, switch from complete kind of animal products to at least being, flexitarian or go for fully vegan, it's changed completely. And you can see, of course, the drastic demand for this product. So I believe even if I said one change on the individual level doesn't make a change, but still one change can bring, people together, and then it's more. And then the bigger the community is, the better the impact, of course.
Wieland, what's your approach on this?
No, I mean, I think, we need to, there's not one solution to this, right? And regulation, for example, is necessary but not sufficient. And if we create incentives for companies to do more, it's always better. And I mean, we know it. If you just take companies that look at the financials, then they jump as high as they need to, and that's exactly what I think is the wrong approach when it comes to sustainability and climate change. We need to create incentives for companies that they do more. And I think the right carbon price, for example, is certainly one thing, but there's many other ways as well. And I think consumers are getting much more sensible to this topic and do more research and actually double click on certain statements, just like Tim and I discussed. Go behind the marketing message and say, what is the actual impact? And I think that is important, because ultimately that's the opportunity that we all have. But it needs each and every one to contribute in order to make a change. And that's why we also feel that sense of responsibility, because we have a huge reach to our users, and we have, we're a very data-driven company, obviously, so we can provide a lot of information. We have a tool that we call the Environmental Insights Explorer, and where we work with cities to actually uncover additional opportunities to reduce the carbon emissions and so on and so forth. And making use of that, I think, will be a key in this journey.
We've had a viewer question about trading off between 100% renewable, so trading off between power quality and carbon-free sources, which from a gridX perspective, I don't think we need to have a trade-off. With new technology, I think we can have both. But Tim, what's your take on this, or other trade-offs that you come across?
I mean, I would agree. In the long run, we shouldn't have those trade-offs. I mean, in other areas, there's really lots of trade-offs you have all the time. I mean, it's not just about money and sustainability, but it's also about other factors, like employee flexibility, for example, is a trade-off. Like at many of my companies, we have a policy, for example, to never fly if it's less than 500 kilometers. And the trade-off is you mandate something which is potentially against some of the people's flexibility and might make travel harder for them. Is it the right move, though? I think it is, but not everybody would agree. And I think you have lots of those trade-offs.
Daria, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think, it's not like ideally we wouldn't have to have a trade-off, of course. And as you say, we have amazing companies with amazing technology trying or aiming to make this possible. But in the end of the day, it's always like the world is not black and white, right? And it's always a trade-off for someone somehow, right? And I think the key is kind of to understand, as a company especially, what is your set of values and how do you actually live by them, and what is your prioritization and why, and if it comes at cost, that you understand why, and then I think most of our decisions, especially in the context of sustainability and climate, given what our history and how we live and our lifestyle as a person, like individually and in companies, it will always come at cost.
And we've briefly touched on this, but Wieland, how important is transparency in the context of ESG? And how can companies be held accountable so that consumers are really aware of what they're getting?
So I think it's hugely important. We always say at Google, data beats opinions. And so, you can make claims of what you're doing, and it's super hard for the average person to really understand what a certain claim means and how big of an impact it actually is if you don't look at the data behind it. And so, I'd like to come back to that example. The goal to be 24/7 carbon free for a company like Google is, when you look at the numbers, really ambitious. And if everyone would do that, we would have zero carbon emissions. And that, of course, is a dream, but to get there is super hard. Our goal is to take a data-driven approach and then share what we learn in this journey in the next few years. Hopefully we even get there in certain areas earlier, and I'm pretty hopeful, actually, based on the data that I see, that we can accomplish that earlier. But then share that to make sure that everyone can learn from it. And that's what we're trying to do. And I mentioned the Environmental Insight Explorer, but we have other data-driven tools that actually help others to become more sustainable. The Maps example is a good one, not just for car rides, but also for flights, for example, to make sure that you actually get alternatives. And then somebody says, hey, this flight is that much carbon emission, but why don't you take the train, right? These are wonderful examples where if you just as a consumer see the data and say, oh, okay, I can see the cost, I can see the carbon, I can make that trade-off. Right now, that's practically impossible because you don't have that information directly in front of you when you need to make that decision. And I think at GreenTech just the other week, Gail Whiteman also said, we need a dashboard for the world. And I really like that as a data-driven company, and I'd love to figure out how we can make that happen for a lot of these types of things. And then our sustainability reports are way beyond what we need to disclose. They're books, basically, and it's pretty exciting to read what we do. Also, not just for electricity, you asked that earlier, but also down the supply chain for our products and so on and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, the data dashboard, that's a great idea, because also it would force every company to not share selectively, because that's what's happening at the moment. And I think, Daria, that's the difference to the financial compliance, which sometimes appeared. It was mandated, and it forced companies to regulate and to share certain numbers at the moment. And I mean, that's kind of the main point of this panel, is why we're talking about greenwashing. Every company is just sharing very selectively. And of course, there's a lot of things which every company knows which could be done better, but they're not shared. And I mean, my startup aren't in most cases better there than Google and any of the other big corporations. I think they're all equally guilty, because still the main measurement is still profitability. Let's face it, especially for public companies. And so greenwashing is happening everywhere. I think it's almost an inherent problem of completely profit-driven companies, to be honest.
Yeah, I would challenge that, Tim. That it is, because the way you said it, it sounds like intentional, and I think that's probably not necessarily what's going on. I think you need to look behind the curtain. You need to also look at the DNA of the company and the employees at the company and how they are behind it. And I'll give you just a very, very simple example. We have 0 parking places for our employees here in Munich. There's not a single employee parking place, because we're in the middle of the city, and people can come with public transportation. If they need to, they can rent a parking spot on their own, but we don't pay for it. There's no company cars at Google.
No,
right?
I wasn't meaning to attack Google on this. I think it's a general systemic problem. But again, I think it's happened, you shared a specific item, which is great, by the way. Congrats to the parking spot. I didn't know that. And that's practice in actually most of my companies as well. And I think it's a really good practice. But, I could give you 5 other practices which don't look that good. And again, we shouldn't do that, because it shouldn't be about Google and Ecosia here. But I think that selective greenwashing is happening everywhere. And I think, we can't escape that, because that's what a company is mandated to do, namely look good in public so that people buy their products.
But it's not only about public, right? It's also about startups. If you look at DAX we get now,
startups aren't any better.
Out of the sudden, every single startup is actually climate tech startup. Every single, whatever they do, there is always the impact part of it. And I think it's also, it goes, of course, back it goes back to the overall climate discussion, but it also goes back to the investors, right? Because kind of I assume as a founder, this is where I get money for now. So I start greenwashing in a way because I start like looking for some stories I can tell. So, and then investors actually don't go deeper into that. They say like, okay, so sounds good. I'm a climate investor now. So I think it's not only
investors are the same. Yeah, they are the same. A lot of funds are greenwashing by having selective investments in that field now, and we see that. Yeah.
And what methods can you use to determine if a company really is green or if it is just greenwashing?
Well, probably kind of look deeper, right? And define a set of criteria to say like, how do you define, what's greenwashing in terms of, as an investor, for example, there is like two different pockets, because one is it kind of a sustainable business model in a way, like Tim said before, is it the part like, have I built a product or a service which is like at core attacking the climate crisis, right? This is one. And then whatever else I do, which may be amazing, right? We don't need we have so many problems in the world. We don't really need only climate tech startups now or companies, right? But do I live as an organization about like kind of upon these rules or a set of framework? It can be no parking spots. It can be whatever. But I think this is like two different topics for me, right? And I think one is, of course, easier to kind of measure, but the second, it's a little bit, I think we're in the progress. I wouldn't expect every company actually also to have all the answers, because they're like, it's still not really clear what everyone has to do, right? So, but looking deeper, asking questions, as an investor especially as well, kind of making it clear that it's a part of your investment decision, I think that then will make a difference. Because as long as it's just like, okay, well, I have a framework, I have to report to my stakeholders, my investors, so I do 3 crosses, okay, it's done, and then their startup, it's very shallow, but so again, show me that you have this and this. This is very easy, but that doesn't change anything, right? So everyone has to really mean it. And I think mean it means that there is a consequence. And as an investor, again, the consequence would be, in the worst case, I don't invest, because that doesn't apply to what I expect for, right?
And Tim, what are the main forms of greenwashing that you've come across in the energy industry?
Well, definitely on the consumer side. I mean, the fact that actually the energy industry is kind of one of the hardest, because as a consumer, you get your power from the power plug no matter what happens. It's like such an invisible product. It's one of the hardest. And so when companies market green power, we all know that it's a very, very broad range, whether it is, as Wieland correctly said, whether it's incremental power and really going into increasing the amount of renewable energy in the grid, or whether it's simply shifting. So if I buy a contract and it's essentially just reducing the renewable power of someone else, then nothing has been gained, except that I pay more money and the energy company makes more. That is absolutely useless. And so that would be a prime example. But even in the B2B field, you could find notable examples, as Daria said, where every company says, "Oh, I'm climate tech and I do something energy wise, which is good for the climate," but essentially it is nothing like that.
We've had a question from an audience member. I'll leave it open to whoever would like to answer. What do you think about the Dow Jones Sustainability Indices? They've become the key reference for sustainability investing.
I think this is a good those type of labels and standardizations are really, really good in general, not just in investing, but also for other areas. And that, by the way, to the earlier question, is on how can you bring transparency. Those really tough seals, those can be really good. So at Ecosia, for example, what we've done is we mark a lot of those. When we do a search on Ecosia, we mark a lot of those organizations with a little green leaf. So, for example, the ones which are certified B Corp, very good standard, very high standard. Economy for the Common Good, for example. Hilfswerft, German organization, also really good labels. And that's kind of like the top of the top. So that would be an equivalent of organic food. It would be the Demeter standard, for example. So on a very high level. And I think there needs to be more of these and more transparency, although it's hard for the consumer to really see through with all those seals. But I think that's a lot of efforts need to go into this direction.
I think, Wieland, does Google also have a seal? Because I see, the Google logo, and then on the other side you have a green G with the leaf.
No, that's just our logo for our sustainability efforts. So we don't actually give a seal ourselves, but obviously we use them quite a bit. For example, for our building projects, and the building you see behind me that's just under construction is a restoration or renovation project, but we will go way beyond what's necessary. We will meet, for example, LEED Platinum certification for all the sustainability efforts that we're taking. And we actually are working with the city to make sure that we can meet our goal of being CO2 or carbon free by the time we want to, because the energy that we get may not actually meet these standards. So we are pushing others to deliver what we need to accomplish our goals, which then incentivizes again. We had to build parking spaces, even though we don't want them and don't use them. So now we are trying to figure out what we can do with them, because we have no use for it. But these are challenges that are interesting and that make a project like that fun. But it also, I think, incentivizes others to think about this and say, oh, this is interesting. I didn't know. And why are you doing this? And how are you doing this? And can we learn from that? So that, I think, is an effort that everyone should take. But I agree with you and with Tim that the strong seals, and that's, again, we need to double click on them and say, what exactly is behind that? What's the Demeter level of sustainability? And then I think we will all gain, because then it's actually worth having a label. If you have 100 labels and they all kind of imply that you're sustainable, then it's actually not helpful.
And Wieland, Daria mentioned before that there need to be consequences for companies if they're not truly green. What do you think would be the main consequences for Google if the company didn't meet the standards that it should?
I think there's probably not short-term consequences, but there's certainly, as I said earlier, consumers care, and they come to certain companies because they look for the values and the purpose behind it. And so at some point it will come back to that and say, you're not doing the right thing for this planet, and we don't want to support you. And when you look at the huge shift in how fast now the electrification of the auto industry went, you can now argue that it's actually not necessarily the best thing. There's other ways where you can do even more impact on the environment, but hugely driven by perception and by the way this technology has been positioned. And I drive electric myself, and once you actually make that step, and I produce my own energy on my own roof, and I use gridX to actually optimize my energy management in my house, and we have a lot of fun together. I have batteries in the basement to capture the energy I save during the day, so I can be neutral during at night, and so on and so forth. Once you experience what it means to live in that way and drive electric, then you don't want to go back. And so making sure that people understand the benefits and don't look at the disadvantages, is important, and that's the definition of disruptive technology, right? I mean, you don't need to be better than what's there. You need to be good enough in some of the metrics, like range, for example. Electric cars are good enough now, but then you need to be significantly disruptive in others, and that's exactly what's happening. And I think that's a super exciting development. It's the same for the energy market. If we, all support companies like gridX and make sure that exactly what I just described is becoming mainstream, we can have a big impact together.
Mm-hmm. And
but just like to play devil's advocate here for all of us, because so I'm currently in Latvia, and I'm meeting different like people outside of our tech bubble, right? And then still, and it's not about Latvia, it's just about like I'm here, and it's a different bubble. And we talk about like what we do, like what I do as an investor, and a lot, and companies I invested in a lot, and then I kind of on an individual level, and it happens to me quite a bit. I kind of see like people don't really like, they understand, but they don't want to change themselves because they think it doesn't like whatever the company says and whatever the rules, I apply to the rules, but I don't care because it yet doesn't like, as of like my perception of my environment now is it doesn't apply to me. It will happen, maybe not. It's kind of, and I think the question is how do we, because how do we actually address that, right? Because whatever technology we use, Wieland, you use, I know that your whole house is very optimized and efficient, Tim. So with you, but are we not still like too small to actually drive the change? And then it has to happen on a different scale. And how do we pick up on, how do we address this other scale? What do you think?
Well, I think we talked about this already.
It's a $1 million question, and it's great that you bring it up. I mean, I would say to a certain extent, the COVID pandemic has taught us a little bit about the difference between rules on one side and self-discipline on the other side. And to a certain extent, it's made me hopeful, but in other areas, I'm thinking like, okay, if humanity is treating climate change with that same approach, we're doomed. So I think it's very similar to what we need in terms of a mix of a change of behavior. Media plays a really important role, but regulations play a role, and role models in regards to both companies, employers have quite a say because they can make certain rules, and hopefully it's the combination of these things. Like other things have changed over decades. I mean, women weren't allowed to vote at some point. There was slavery many years before that, and so on. You could go on and on about things where today we say it's absolutely crazy. And I'm hopeful that a combination of certain factors change the behavior of the society as a whole. But it's a great question.
Wieland, what's your view on this? Do we need systemic change, and how can we get there?
I mean, we do need systemic change, but I also feel we actually are in the middle of a systemic change. If you look at everything that's happening with Fridays for Future and the electrification of the powertrain and the Green Deal and so on and so forth. So I think we need to appreciate the appetite for change, and we need to reinforce it with the right measures, rather than constantly saying this is not enough or not happening. It is not enough. That's clear. But I also think reinforcing positive energy is always better than creating too many independent or disconnected initiatives. And so that's what we all need to do. We need to make sure that people come together and to support that change it's a movement almost in many ways, right? And then also long term, I think that is going to be how companies will be successful. That is what the market will prove. This is what the investors will actually go after, and then it actually, I think, is self-sustaining. Just to add a pun that I think will make sense here.
And just some final words from each of you. Are you hopeful about our future of corporate sustainability? And what do you think will be the most decisive factors in achieving carbon neutrality? Start with Tim.
Well, I'm partially hopeful. I think there are a lot of good companies. Google certainly is one of them. There are a lot of bad ones out there. They don't talk about this. They just kind of go and print money and give shit about everything else. And it's still the majority of the companies. And then, of course, there's some, especially really well-meaning startups and non-profit organizations who push the bar even higher. But with that big breadth, I think we would need a more systemic change on a political level to actually get, especially all the bad apples moving faster. They are the problem here, as Daria said, like not us here in this bubble. I mean, we're just debating this on a fairly high level, I would say. But the problem is, how do we move this more mainstream? And that, in my opinion, won't go without force. But yeah, I'm somewhat optimistic, but not fully.
Yeah, and I agree. I'm optimistic, maybe a little bit more than Tim, but I also agree that we need force, but maybe more a pull force than a push force, and creating incentives to do the right thing. Because without that, you will not get the companies that are just hiding behind the regulations that are currently in existence. You need to create incentives that are beyond regulation to actually get these companies to move.
I would love to be optimistic. I think, well, let's say so. Like, I'm by nature, I think I have doubts about us as humanity, to be honest. Just given the data from all the history, but I choose to be optimistic. And I think as a venture capital investor, we have such a privilege to have such an early access to not only capital, but also to knowledge, to amazing, sometimes crazy entrepreneurs, right? Daring to actually do something for a change of systems, and to technology, to kind of all these components that kind of enable us to bring them together and actually be able to contribute a little bit more, so the future could be more optimistic. So that's why I choose to be optimistic, even if I'm kind of, not 100% sure what happens, as everyone.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, all three of you. That was a very, at times, heated, but really productive discussion. And yeah, we're really grateful that you could all take the time to chat with us today. Thanks.
Thanks.
Thank you.